Hi, and welcome to the 77th in our Middle Eastern Islamic History series. Today, we're going to talk about the Islamic Republic of Iran and the rules for those of you who are unfamiliar. This is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in any discipline related to history, religion, politics, philosophy. I'm doing this from a layperson's perspective. That said, I will try to keep this secular and therefore come at this from an objective perspective. That said, this is going to be a sensitive topic like all topics in Middle Eastern history, so I encourage everyone to be respectful. That said, I love interactivity, questions, comments, clarifications. Please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time. What I like to say is that these presentations are a 101 and a 201. A 101 meaning that if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up. And a 201 meaning that if you already know the basics, I'll probably still tell you things you didn't know. What I like to say is that there's a 2-hour hard stop. So if I don't get to the end of my presentation today, after 2 hours, that's okay. We'll go right to the question and answer section. And any of the slides that are left over, those will be the starters for next week. What I like to say is that the dates below a person, if they're a politician, are their years of service. If they are for thought leaders, those are the years of their life. So sort of think about it before you look at those dates. And this is recorded like the other members of the Middle Eastern Islamic History series. And you can find all those recordings, all 76 of our previous presentations, and this presentation will be on our YouTube page. And I encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube page to see all of the different series that we have put together. And if you want to be in our Zoom in real time to enjoy the presentations and ask your questions, I encourage you to join our meetup. Other meetups may show some or part of the presentations we put on, but if you go here, you will see everything from all the different groups that we host. As I was saying, you can see our YouTube link there. You can see our meetup link there. And we encourage you to join our meetup to be part of the Zoom and see these presentations in real time. We also really appreciate PayPal donations and buy a coffee because Zoom, Meetup, and YouTube are premium subscriptions that we maintain. That said, we will continue to deliver these lectures for free. But if you feel that you've been enriched and that you're growing from this, please consider giving us a little bit of cover. All right. So one of the things that we discussed today was that in Iran, there is a strong sense, especially during the 19th and the first 2/3 of the 20th century, that Iran was subject to the whims of imperial powers. And in the 19th century, those imperial powers were Russia and Britain. What's going on here, right, is that historically, Russia and Britain were competitors. And we can see some elements of that competition, right, in the fact that the Russian Empire and the British Empire don't actually touch. There's that sliver in Afghanistan that connects to China, which kept those two empires from touching. Because if they did touch, there might be some violence along the border and lead to increased hostility between the two powers and a major military confrontation. And this fits into the Great Game as that existed at that period. Now, in 1907, the Great Game fundamentally changed because Britain and Russia were now on the same side. They both feared an ascendant Germany, and because of that, Britain and Russia were willing to bury the hatchet and therefore come together. And this was disastrous for Iran because now Iran could not use one as leverage against the other. And eventually, that led to the large-scale concessions that we've talked about in the previous presentation, such as the Darcy concession, which led to the British having access to the majority of Iranian oil, especially in that southwestern region labeled here as Arabistan, meaning the land of the Arabs, currently Khuzestan province, where the Abadan refinery, Iran's largest single refinery, is located, and was the headquarters of first the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which became later the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and is today known as British Petroleum, or BP. One of the interesting events of where all the stars aligned, for want of a better term, in Iranian history was that revolution of 1905 to 1906 that we've talked a little bit about before. And in that revolution, we have the religious class led by the mujtahids, the acclaimed religious scholars, aligning with liberal non-religious individuals, either from the bazari, the merchant class, or the land-owning class, and just generally people who had been educated along Western lines, to overthrow the monarchy in a limited way. There was still a monarch, but now there would be a majlis, or a parliament. And this was seen as a shining moment for most Iranians, because Iran's history has almost consistently been the pushback against authoritarian control. At least it has been in the last 150 years or so. And this was a moment where more power was centralized out of the leadership than before. There are a couple questions. I'm going to respond to those in the Q&A because they're not directly pertinent. So the key piece here, though, to take into account is that when the majlis was coordinated and you had the electors coming from those three dominant classes in Persian society, the landowners, the religious scholars, and the bazari, or the merchants, almost all of the delegates in the regional assembly who gained power were in some way or another religious clerics. Even the leader of the liberal side, Taghi-Zadeh, who you can see here on the right side, he wasn't a cleric by profession, but he had gone to clerical school. The leader of the moderates, you can see Behbehani there in the picture, but Tabatabai was also one of these, were both clerics. And the leaders of the royalist faction, like Fazlallah Nuri, who you can see there in that picture, were also clerics. And so we should understand that in the democratic process of Iran, the clerics did involve themselves in politics to a very strong degree, regardless of whether they directly took seats or not, and regardless of whether they directly joined the government or not, they were certainly politically involved. And this is something that is fundamentally distinct from a lot of the other places in the Middle East that we've seen, where either you have a direct power that is religious, and it is a singular power, or the religious individuals are kept out of the government. In Iranian democracy, as it existed in the 1905 Majlis, 1906 Majlis, we see religious individuals playing a secular role in governing the country, but coming at it from very differing ideological perspectives. Unfortunately, the Persian Revolution was not to last, and there was internecine strife brought on by, in this case, the Russians, where the Russians supported the king, the Shah, in reasserting his authority in 1908. And the Russians wanted to do this specifically because they preferred an authoritarian Shah that they could control more effectively than all of these different politicians who may have aims that were distinct from those of Russia. We then talked about how in 1921, after the Qajar dynasty had been reinstated, that they had their own rebellion from the Persian Cossacks, led by Reza Khan. Now, the Persian Cossacks were called that because it was a division of the Persian military created by the Russians. It was an elite division of the Persian military, but it was staffed entirely by ethnic Iranians. One of these was a commander, Reza Khan, who you can see there. And the British felt that Reza Khan leading an uprising against the Ahmad Shah Qajar, the last Qajar ruler of Iran, would be in their interest, because for all of his faults, Reza Khan was not interested in Soviet expansion or in communism. And so the British thought that he would serve as a more effective bulwark on Russian expansion than would the Qajar Shah, who, of course, was only really in power because the Russians were supporting the Persian Cossacks that allowed him to be in power. And so, as we discussed, he had to put down a lot of different ethnic revolts in different parts of the country, such as the revolts in Azerbaijan led by communist sympathizing Azerbaijanis, and the Kurds led by Simko Shikek, who were trying to create an independent Kurdish state in northern Iran as well. Both of these rebellions were quashed, as we discussed. And during the 1930s, we see Reza Khan increasingly bring more and more power to his person, such that he ends up killing or causing to commit suicide or long-term imprisoning or exiling nearly every one of his major capable politicians, and the Majlis effectively becomes a rubber stamp. So many of the goals that he had for the country were goals that he was able to implement because he was effectively the state. One thing in particular, and we're going to sort of talk about this a little bit more today, is the kashf hijab, or the forcible removal of the veil. Starting in 1933, Reza Khan made it illegal for women to veil. And of course, this was met with angry protests by much of the religious establishment, including in Gohar Shad Mosque, which you can see there, where you had a large gathering of traditional Muslims led by mujtahids protesting against the forcible removal of the hijab from women. And it ended up going into a shootout where the regime was basically impugned for its use of violence against a mosque, which was strongly antithetical to the Iranian tradition of best, or security. So in 1940, the Allies removed Reza Khan. Sorry, 1941, the Allies removed Reza Khan in what was called, called Operation Countenance. And when he was removed, there was almost no revolt from the Iranian military, which, despite it being extremely large and extremely overpowered, was simply too angry with Reza Khan to argue against his removal, and said his son was appointed in his stead. We talked about, of course, that the Shah, when he began to rule in almost a constitutional way. He had a number of individuals who were resurrected from the 1905-1906 period and from the early 1920s, who began to rule again from those parties. But everything changed about the Shah's governing style with the petroleum nationalization crisis in the 1950s. So starting in 1951, you have Mossadegh, who became the leader of the National Front, a coalition of, let's call them Western-style democratic parties. And this coalition of parties was generally in favor of the nationalization of Iranian oil, or the renegotiation substantially with Britain over the ownership of Abadan refinery and the profits derived therefrom. And Mossadegh had a strong ally in Marja Abdul Ghasem Khashani, who was one of the mujtahids existing at that time. And so the two of them formed a very strong alliance in 1951 and in early 1952 to stand against the British and demand that increased profit sharing or increased control, or both, of the Abadan refinery and other Iranian exportation sites would go to the government. But the coalition was held together on this particular issue. There were other issues on which they fundamentally disagreed, such as the secularization of the country, such as the long-term relationship with other countries and states. Mossadegh was, for example, more partial to a decent relationship with the Soviet Union than Abdul Ghasem Khashani was. You have these sort of distinctions and differences in their opinion. And so by 1952, they had basically split apart, and that coalition had broken. The Americans and British seized this opportunity to begin discussing the possibility of removing Mossadegh and making sure that the British retain control of the Abadan refinery under those specific terms. So in August of 1953, the United States helps a coup d'etat against Mossadegh, led by Fazlollah Zahidi, a monarchist military leader, and they pay Shaban Jafari and other mafiosos in Tehran to get a large protest together. And of course, they reached out to Abul Qasim Kashani, who was able to bring forward the Islamist contingent to march as well. Of course, there were counter protests led by Tudeh, the Communist Party, that were in favor of Mossadegh continuing to have power. And in fact, Tudeh became Mossadegh's bigger partner during 52 to 53. But because Mossadegh had alienated Kashani, and because there were issues in his relationship with Tudeh, these protests and revolts paid for, subsidized in a certain extent by the Americans and the British, were able to overthrow him and put the Shah back into power. And when the Shah came back into power, he came back into power in an authoritarian way. The Tudeh sympathizers were persecuted. The National Front, which was the coalition of parties that Mossadegh had assembled, was disbanded. Zahidi himself was recalled to his military post, so that way the Shah could take political power. And two new political parties were created, the Novin and Mordom parties, which were jokingly called the Yes and the Yes Sir parties, in that they were effectively both rubber stamps for the will of the Shah. And you had the creation of the Savak, or the secret police, which operated in Iran from 1957 until 1979, and brought dissidents, such as those that I just discussed, as well as Islamists as well, to prison to be tortured and removed from public society in a way that would keep the peace. Now, there were some accommodationalist marjas like Borujerdi, who you can see there, who had decent relations with the Shah, but by and large, the Islamist leadership disagreed with him, especially Kashani's ideological successor, former student, Ruhollah Khomeini. Now, one of the things that we have to sort of address during this period again is the massive sense of dislocation that Iranians were feeling. Now, we see this throughout the Middle East. In fact, if we look at populations in the Middle East in the year 1900 and we compare them with numbers today, it's astounding how different those numbers are. A perfect example is that Egypt was between 10 and 12 million people in 1900. Today, it's over 100 million. Syria, before the war, was about 20 million people, 25 million people. In 1900, it was about 5. So this massive jump in population that you can see in the graph below, from roughly 15 to 16 million to around 40 million by 1980, wasn't unique. But what was unique in the Iranian situation was the urbanization and the rapid destruction of the historic way of life that had existed in Iran. Most of the other Middle Eastern countries didn't industrialize at the same pace or at the same rate, and therefore didn't urbanize with the same degree. And those who did urbanize often found that they were moving to the cities where they had no support networks, where they had no connections, where they were going to look for jobs, and the only jobs they were qualified for were low-wage jobs, which meant that they were living in the southern part of the city, which you can see in the upper picture, that lower city, and they were just up about abutting Tehran's upper city, or the northern part of the city, were upper class and upper middle class Iranians who were astoundingly wealthy, well-connected, and organized were living. And this cultural juxtaposition created a situation where those who would reach out to form relationships with this incoming population were exactly those who would benefit. And since those incoming populations from the rural areas were disproportionately conservative, were disproportionately religious, this provided fertile ground for the mujtahids to begin to preach to them and create a coalition of individuals larger than they had had previously because of the concentration in the cities. So we then see the Shah trying to further improve the economic situation, hoping that the growth of the Iranian economy, the growth of literacy, women's rights, increased landholding would lead to the creation of a middle class. And by and large, it didn't. The land ownership issue was primarily that not enough peasants were given access to land, and to the ones who weren't given access to sufficient land to sustain themselves, meaning that they eventually sold their land to the large landowners anyway. And the mechanization in the fields, which the Shah also supported, meant that there was need for fewer and fewer farmhands, which ended up leading to those people further going into the cities, where they would become part of those dislocated contingents. The literacy campaign did increase the educated population within Iran, but it was slow and steady work. And so you have resistance to these kinds of actions coming from the mujtahids, who argue that the Shah is disconnected from the needs of the people, disconnected from his religious obligations as a Muslim to look after the population. And one of the things that we have to understand about religious clerics at this time and throughout the Middle East is that in many cases, they are the equivalent of the Amnesty International, in the sense that they are the ones who are willing to talk about difficult social issues as a challenge and as a rebuke to intransigent leadership, because they believe that God will protect them. And so you have this relationship that many people see with these religious leaders as being the vanguard and defense of their rights, contrary to what we see in the West, where religious leaders are generally seen as those who are interested in diminishing access to rights under a secular government and constitution. There's a question of whether land ownership was exclusive only to the wealthy before the White Revolution. Land ownership was disproportionately held by wealthy individuals who had been landowners for centuries, specific noble families who had long-term access to those lands. And the vast bulk of Iranians' peasantry, and remember, if we go back to 1956, even as late as 1956, less than 33% of the population was living in urban centers. Iran's population at the beginning of the 20th century was over 80% rural, and the vast bulk of that population were either owners of very small parts of land or sharecroppers on large and massive estates. So while a lot of Iranians were peasants, they didn't have their own land, and so you had this ownership to usage issue. Great question. So we have this massive economic growth that is primarily fueled by the rise in value of oil, and by the Shah being able to renegotiate in the late 1960s and early 1970s a 50-50 profit-sharing agreement with the British. And this led to a massive amount of investment by the Shah, who directly received the money from these oil revenues, into the building of his military, into the requisitioning of supplies, into a lot of personal actions. For example, he created large-scale endowments for his family, and of course, in the development of the country by creating new schools and increasing literacy and all the major infrastructural developments that he pursued. But the increase in purchasing power from those on top as a result of oil led to a mass amount of inflation within Iran itself. And so the poor became relatively poorer by the dint that the costs of living increased tremendously over this period in time. It's one of those cases where a rising tide does not lift all boats. And of course, during this period, the American expatriates were disproportionately represented in the country in terms of their power and their ability to operate extraterritorially in Iran. That is to say that they were able to operate under separate laws from the rest of the Iranian population. They lived in walled compounds, and generally speaking, unless they went out in search of Iranian experiences, they lived in compounds that were isolated from the Iranians in their neighborhood. There were all kinds of examples of this, such as how when you have the American school in Tehran, only American citizens could go, in contrast to most other American schools around the world, where local citizens are more than welcome. And in those schools, parents strongly objected to any discussion of Iran or Iranian history in the curriculum for the American school in Tehran, in order to focus more on American civics and ideals in the general curriculum. During this period, we see minority rights exist in sort of two different bubbles. You have religious minorities like the Jews, the Armenians, the Assyrians, the Baha'i, the Zoroastrians, and their religious freedoms are relatively protected. They're able to worship freely to their gods and build centers of worship. On the other side, you have ethnic minorities, especially when it comes to the Kurds and the Azeri, who are connected with those independence movements that existed in 1946. And some of the other more independence-minded minorities did not get treated very well under the Shah, and therefore had a number of their languages minimized, their role in government reduced, and similar. There's a question of whether the military was overdeveloped during this period. That's absolutely the case. Both Reza Khan and Muhammad Reza Shah built the military beyond what was necessary for the protection of the Iranian heartland. And in many cases, it was seen as a way to demonstrate their own power more than it was something that was necessary. That money could have been spent on the Iranian economy. There are jokes about Muhammad Reza Shah that he bought more Chieftain tanks, which is a British-made tank, than the British Army possessed. So you have this sort of juxtaposition of massive spending on the military with less development, let's say, for the average Iranian. So by 1978, you have a situation where the Shah had effectively alienated every one of the major stakeholders in Iran. He alienated the Bazari or merchant class because he began to punish them on account of the inflation. Basically, they were raising prices in accordance with inflation, and then he would attack them for price gouging, which no matter how many times you attack a merchant, they're not going to sell things for less than they cost. So he alienated the merchant class through these kinds of actions. He alienated the landowning class by redividing all their assets in the White Revolution. He alienated the ulama by trying to take over their power. He tried to create a national Islamic ministry, similar to Turkey's Diyanet, that failed. He tried to increase the role of women in society. That generally succeeded. Women still have the right to vote, even in the Islamic Republic, for whatever a vote is worth in the Islamic Republic. He alienated them by having a secular government, and he alienated them through the concessions to Westerners. So you would think that perhaps he could fall back on secular-oriented, Western-oriented individuals, and even they were alienated because of the human rights abuses of the Savak, or the secret police. Now, because he had alienated each group in succession, and the Tudeh because he persecuted them directly, the communists, you then had a coalition that was willing to build around the idea of a revolution in Iran to remove the Shah. Somebody asks about the references. Sure. You can look up Michael Axworthy. He is that's one of my sources. You then have Takei, who wrote about the period of the last Shah. And there are a number of other sources that refer to this period. So we then come to the revolution itself. And the revolution itself took place from the late part of 1977 through 1978. And sort of ended in 1979 with the Shah's departure from Iran on the 16th of January 1979. Now, during this period, there were a number of protests and increasingly violent resistance to those protests from the government. Those violent acts ended up coming in the form of small massacres, and there were also events that were blamed on the government, which weren't necessarily the government's fault, like the Cinema Rex fire, which took place on the 19th of August, 1978, in which over 400 people were burned alive as the cinema was torched. It was believed at the time that the Shah's government was responsible. However, it turned out that in actuality, an Islamist militant was the one who set it ablaze. But of course, that information didn't come out until decades later. And so you had the leader of the National Front, Mehdi Bazargan, the sort of spiritual successor of Mossadegh, fly to Paris, France, where he met with Ayatollah Khomeini in order to create a new kind of government. And so Khomeini returned to Iran in February of 1979, appointed Bazargan to be his prime minister, and the two of them began the process of turning Iran into an Islamic Republic, definition to come later. What's important to point out is that the Western states decided in the Guadeloupe Conference that they did not believe that the Shah was going to be it wouldn't be effective to defend the Shah. And that a return of Khomeini to Iran would be acceptable because as an Islamist, he would be anti-Soviet and therefore keep Iran out of the Soviet sphere. Given that the Shah had alienated so many partners within the country, his rule, while preferable, couldn't continue. And so they refused to provide a coup or engage in any other diplomatic overture that would have protected the Shah. And so we enter the early phase of the new Islamic Republic. Before Bazargan becomes the prime minister in truth, the prime minister actually stays on from when the Shah left. So the Shah left on the 19th of January, and a few days before he left, he appointed his own new prime minister, Shapur Bakhtiar, and he was from the traditional Bakhtiari clans, so that's one of those minority representations there. But his attempt was to keep the country united and to prevent the descent into chaos. One of the things to point out, though, is that Khomeini did not want to work with Bakhtiar at all. And so when he made his deal with Mehdi Bazargan, the country actually had at that point two separate prime ministers who were both fighting for control of the country, more or less. Bakhtiar was removed from his position on the 11th of February and forced into exile soon after. So what ends up happening and ends up being Khomeini's way of increasingly consolidating control in a country that was effectively still in a position where the Shah's military existed, although they said that they would be neutral in the regime change. And you still had police officers and the Savak and all these other entities that still existed. You ended up with the creation of the Comité. And the Comité were these revolutionary committees. They were made of armed militants that would go around the country, and the Hezbollah, who were plainclothes Iranians. And these two groups would brandish weapons and attack enemies of the Ayatollah. You can see it in many ways similar to the brown shirts in Nazi Germany, where it's not that the government directly is performing an action, but the government permits brigands to perform actions that will work on its behalf. One of the discussions that ends up happening is over the future of Evin prison. Evin prison was a prison constructed by the Shah for the handling of many of his dissidents. Ayatollah Khomeini sees the value in retaining this kind of institution and ends up sending his own political prisoners there. The Savak itself was reformed in the sense that many of its top leaders were executed in revolutionary tribunals. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But once you had eliminated the top rank of those individuals, the rest of the Savak was incorporated into the Savama, which was the Islamic Republic's Ministry of Intelligence. It's gone through several different name changes, but in essence, much of the playbook of Savak was then transferred to the new agents running the Savama, and the Ayatollah was able to maintain the architecture of the police state the Shah had built. It's worth now talking a little bit about those revolutionary tribunals. So the Ayatollah was in an interesting position from a governance perspective. On one side, he had individuals like Mehdi Bazargan who wanted to maintain a facade of normalcy, who wanted to act within traditionally established diplomatic frameworks for dealing with members of the ancien regime, perhaps exile, perhaps imprisonment. And you had hardline reactionaries and revolutionaries, such as those in the Comité and the Hezbollahi. And Khomeini sort of sat between them. So what he decided to do in order to try and bridge the gap, you can debate how successful he was in this, was to create revolutionary tribunals where individuals who were associated with the Shah's government were tried and executed routinely by these institutions. This was frowned upon in most diplomatic circles, and many in the National Front, which was Bazargan's party, for want of a better term, were opposed to these revolutionary councils anyway. And this created a lot of friction within the government of the nascent Islamic Republic. There's a question here about the role of women. Women, by and large, were ostracized from this process. Ayatollah Khomeini did not want to involve them in the government to the extent that he could. There were, of course, women on the liberal side, but most of the leaders were still the men. As I mentioned, when Iran was declared an Islamic Republic in a national referendum, the term hadn't actually been defined. And so the question was still left as to what Iran's constitution would be. And so beginning in the first few months of the Islamic Republic, there was an election, but it was an election that Ayatollah Khomeini managed to control. How did he control this election? The first thing is that he only would allow 1 or 2 people per province to attend this new national convention that would write the Islamic Republic's constitution. And he did it on a province by province basis, so that way, disproportionately, the rural areas would be represented, areas that tended to vote more conservatively. He also made sure that the candidates that would run were disproportionately clerics. And so when this vote had been completed, over 75% of the members of Iran's constitutional convention were clerics of one form or another. And that led to a disproportionate representation of their views in the first constitution that was promulgated on the 14th of June in 1979. Now, there were some individuals like Mahmoud Taleghani who were clerics, but who fundamentally believed that the act of governance should not be one handled by the clerics themselves. He argued that the traditional Shiite position had been that the Shiites would influence political views, but they wouldn't control them. And so what their primary function would be to advise politicians on the direction that they should go, advise politicians on the views they should have, lead protests in the streets, make fatwas, but stay out of the direct political process. Taleghani, however, despite being a pro-revolutionary, he was in favor of Khomeini's revolution and was friendly with Khomeini. In fact, he negotiated a number of the ceasefires that occurred as the Comité tried to unify Iran under the Ayatollah's control. But he became an enemy of the regime in Ayatollah Khomeini's eyes when he began to talk about a retrenchment of the role a return of the role of the Shiite cleric to the street as opposed to the halls of politics. Eventually, he was called to Qom and made to answer for his mistakes. And Khomeini made the point of calling him Mr. Talagani as opposed to referring to his clerical title, Ayatollah, specifically in order to argue that he was no longer relevant within the discussion of the development of the Islamic Republic. And we're going to see this in many different ways as authority gets consolidated. And the first group that Ayatollah Khomeini went against, generally speaking, was the left. And in order for him to consolidate his power against the left, he created the Pasdaran, or the Guardians. The long form name of them is the Iranian Revolutionary Guardian Council, but they're commonly known as the Pasdaran, or the Guardians. And this is actually a later picture, but the Pasdaran were the next level up from the Comité, in that their fundamental job was to move around Iran and attack enemies of the revolution. It's important to understand the distinction because this looks like a military between the Pasdaran and the Iranian army. The Iranian army's primary function is to protect the borders of the country of Iran and to defend against those enemies who may be extraterritorial. The role of the IRGC is internal. Their role is to seek out those who would betray the revolution, those who would oppose the expansion of the ideals of Vilayat al-Faqih, the guardianship of the jurist. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a bit. And the revolutionary fervor that it could inspire in other countries. So the IRGC also has an international footprint, but an international footprint with the goal of exporting the Islamic Revolution. You have the Pasdaran, therefore, going after many different government entities. The first one that gets targeted are those aligned with the National Front. Probably the most famous of this was the Atalat newspaper. You can see this is actually their most famous headline of when the Shah left. And the Atalat newspaper was attacked by the Hezbollahi and the Pasdaran, such that it would be remade as a mouthpiece of the government, and its views would no longer be critical of it. You also had the Iranian Cultural Revolution in June of 1980. And the Iranian Cultural Revolution was designed to remove all of the left-wing individuals who existed at universities and other cultural centers, so that way they could no longer spread their views. A number of them were forced into exile, many of them were executed. The Cultural Revolution was designed primarily to keep the left-wing ideas of democracy and liberalism out. In fact, despite Iran being called a republic, that was the only term that the Ayatollah supported. He did not support the word democracy. And it's interesting to point out that the word republic in Arabic, Jumhuriya, the word for republic in Persian, which is also Jumhuriya, comes from Arabic and is related to the Arabic word Jumhur, or masses. But the word Demokratiya, which is how the word democracy came in, is clearly a Western import. And so by using only the word republic, he was in that way removing Western influence from Iran in that way. In fact, Ayatollah Khomeini spoke out numerous times of what he called West toxification, or Gharb Zindagi. Gharb Zadegi. And this West toxification was the idea that the Western culture that had come into Iran, especially during the time of the Shahs, had polluted Iran, had removed Iran from its traditional Islamic heritage, and therefore it needed to be cleaned out. The final nail in the coffin for the left was actually the farthest left party being targeted. The Tudeh, or Communist Party, had been relatively accepting of the persecution of the National Front and other center-left groups. But in 1983, there was a purge of Tudeh individuals in the military. In fact, these individuals were shown to Khomeini by intelligence analysis from the Americans, who were afraid of a communist takeover in Iran, and therefore gave the information of these individuals to the Ayatollah so he could exterminate them. You can see there Afzali, who was a naval commander who served with distinction in the Iran-Iraq War until in 1983, he was outed as one of these secret individuals who was a member of the Tudeh party and executed by the Iranian government. Another aspect that will bear a lot of echoes to what has occurred in other countries, especially including the United States, is the view of takfirism. So Talagani is a perfect example here, but we're also going to talk about Shariat Madari and other Ayatollah that increasingly will be ostracized. But on the lesser extent, when you had left-wing and liberal individuals, they were seen as being non-religious Muslims, that they were seen as violating the laws of the religion. And so the Ayatollah accused them of this in order to push them out of having any religious influence. And of course, takfirism, under an increasingly religious constitution, was something that could be met with a criminal punishment. In the midst of this cleansing of the left, we have the Iranian hostage crisis. And the Iranian hostage crisis was brought about by the fact that the former Shah had come to the United States for surgery, and Ayatollah Khomeini reached out to the Americans, arguing that the Shah should be returned to Iran for a trial. The Americans countered, saying that if the Shah returned to Iran, he would probably be executed and subject to a kangaroo court, which is not something that they could do. So the Ayatollah relied again on his Comité and on his Hezbollahi to attack the U.S. embassy and claim that he was not in control directly of what had happened. Bazargan saw that this was one bridge too many. He had tried to fight Ayatollah Khomeini on the consolidation of Iran against the left and the actions of the Pasdaran. He tried to maintain Iran's appeal in the West. He had tried to maintain those kinds of relationships, and the Ayatollah was demonstrating that he was not willing to make any serious concessions to those things. So Bazargan resigned, and a much more Islamist prime minister took his place, Rajai. Now, the Iranian students crowded around the U.S. embassy and took those hostages for 444 days, not releasing them until the end of U.S. President Carter's administration. Now, the act of taking the refugees, the act of taking the hostages from the embassy resulted fundamentally in a breakdown of relations between Iran and the United States. Hadn't recognized Iran after the revolution, but this meant that those relations would certainly not recover for a substantial period of time. Carter authorized what was called Operation Eagle Claw in April of 1980 in order to try and recover the hostages. That operation failed. There was a haboob wind, and haboob is a kind of wind that creates a large sandstorm, leading to one of the refueling planes and one of the original planes bumping into each other and causing that crash that you see there in the picture. Many Americans died, several others survived and were eventually repatriated to the United States, but the United States knew that it needed to pursue diplomatic means to get its officials back. The United States still has not established diplomatic relations with Iran, and the former U.S. embassy has been turned into a museum in Tehran called the Den of Espionage. Iran and the United States, despite not maintaining diplomatic relations, do have consular oversight through third parties. So the United States represents its interest in Iran through the Swiss embassy, and the Iranians represent their interest in the United States through the Pakistani embassy. Yeah, there's a comment that the sorry that the refugees were returned. Sorry, the embassy personnel were returned at 12:01 on January 20th, 1981, just to point out that they were doing it based on Carter no longer being president. And now we get to Khomeini's issue with other Shiites. One of the common perceptions that a lot of people have is that Khomeini's views were the Shiite majority or were consistent with the way Shiites had perceived power and organization in Iran's past. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Khomeini posited this idea called Vilayat al-Faqih, or the guardianship of the jurist, meaning that until such time as the Mahdi or the Mahdi comes, he is one of the individuals who will occur at the end of days in Shiite belief, similar to a Messiah, but the Messiah is also there, so it's a different personage. Until those days, a moral government needs to be created, and the only viable source of morality are those that have studied fiqh, or Islamic jurisprudence. Those people, of course, being faqih, or jurists. And so Vilayat al-Faqih is the guardianship of such jurists of the reins of power. This was an idea that is a departure from the majority of ideas that exist within Shiism regarding political power. And to understand that a little bit better, we need to go back a little bit in Shiite history. If we're talking about the period under the Umayyads and the Abbasids, these were virulently anti-Shiite states. At some points, they were Sunni of the Ash'ari school. At some points, they were Sunni of the they were Sunni of the Mu'tazilite school. It doesn't matter though. Regardless of which Sunni school they operated from, they were virulently anti-Shiite. And so a significant number of Shiite imams were either assassinated, like Hussein at Karbala, were imprisoned, like Jafar as-Sadiq, and a number of them went into hiding. Political power was consistently used to repress and control Shiites until the 1500s, when the Safavids created their Shiite state. And they empowered Shiite leadership, such as those led by Muhammad Bakr Majlisi that we talked about in episode 20. Now, Muhammad Bakr Majlisi did not claim that he had the right to rule, only that he had the right to be authoritative over the creation of ulama, or religious scholars, within the context of a Safavid-ruled state. The guardianship of the jurist was an expansion of that power and a concentration of that power in those jurists that were the elect few, those who had the right opinion. The majority of other Shiites were building on that larger Shiite tradition, that people should stay out of, that the Shiite clerics should stay out of direct governance and should be a moral center, questioning government, directing government, but not being government. One of the most famous individuals and the founder of the Muslim People's Republic Party was Muhammad Kazim Shariat Madari, and another Ayatollah. And he was particularly powerful politically in Azerbaijan, since he was an Azeri Iranian. And his view was that governance should be left to laity, who are operating from that moral core of Shiism. Not surprisingly, the Muslim People's Party was, the Muslim People's Republic Party was banned in the latter part of 1980, and Shariat Madari was more or less avoided as a Shiite leader. He was kept under house arrest. And we see other what are called Islamist left politicians. These are politicians who have left-wing aspirations in the economic sphere and fuse to a certain degree Marxism with their view of Islam. Islam has a very strong concept of societal justice. Islam has a very strong very strong view of charity. And so in much the same way that South American theologians were able to fuse liberation theology with their Catholicism, and therefore create a left-wing form, a political form of Christianity, so were these Islamist politicians like Abul Hassan Bani Sadr able to create a left-wing form of Islam and Islamism. Of course, this was in direct competition with the less Marxist infused, we could say, views of Ayatollah Khomeini. And so he forced Bani Sadr out of the government through a vote of no confidence in June of 1981, despite the fact that he still had 3.5 years in his term. There's a question: what was Rafsanjani's power base, and how did he maintain his power and position given the sharp battles between the hardliners and the so-called moderates? We're going to definitely talk about Rafsanjani in a bit. So now we have a situation where there's a lot of Shiite leadership in Iran with very dissenting opinions about how the country should be governed, even assuming it's governed in a religiously viable way. And so in order to prevent this plurality of opinion from continuing, Ayatollah Khomeini ends up creating a number of seminaries, like the Qom seminary, that would standardize and organize the hierarchy of Shiites within the country and confer upon specific individuals the status of Hujjat al-Islam or Marja or Ayatollah, such that the ability of people to be part of the governing apparatus and to understand their roles and procedures would be circumscribed by him. And furthermore, the version of the Constitution that came out in June of 1979, which was hated by liberals anyway, because of how much power it concentrated in the Ayatollah, was replaced by the Constitution that was passed by referendum in December of 1979, which gave even more power to the Ayatollah. In fact, it created the position of the supreme leader, which would be the person who would be in charge of guiding and organizing the Iranian Republic. Meaning that when it came to the questions of Shiism, especially starting in 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini had an exorbitant amount of power. There were other groups that also resisted Iranian control, and one of these groups was the Mujahideen al-Khalq, or the People's Resistance Fighters. It was founded originally by Masoud Rajavi, and he was a strong friend and ally of Abul Hassan Bani Sadr. And in many ways, the MEK served as sort of the pushback on the Comité, the Hezbollahi, the Pastoran, that existed to support the will of Ayatollah Khomeini on the streets. And so you have attacks such as the attack on 7 Tir being the date, where the MEK attacked an Iranian government building and killed dozens of Iranian leaders. Eventually, Abul Hassan and Masoud Rajavi had to leave Iran because of the Ayatollah being able to consolidate his forces against them, and the MEK relocate. Abul Hassan Bani Sadr ended up going to Paris, but Masoud Rajavi stayed in Iraq and was able to rebuild the MEK battalions in Iraq, and we're going to see how he ends up becoming involved in the Iran-Iraq war, fighting on the Iraqi side against Iran. Fighting on the Iranian side against Iraq from 1980 to 1982, but fighting on the Iraqi side against Iran after that point. And we're going to discuss a little bit about that in a second. The MEK today has oscillated between being considered and not being considered a terrorist group by Western countries. And it's also oscillated between, in its later days, being considered a cult because of the personality cult that ended up developing around Masoud Rajavi in the 90s. So those are conflicting views about the organization. And now it's worth pointing out in the larger geopolitical context that this 1979 situation created a fundamental shift in Middle Eastern politics because Iran became now the center of anti-American and anti-Israeli focus, whereas Egypt, which had been that center since the 1960s, suddenly became part of the American sphere through its creation of a peace with the State of Israel and its receiving of U.S. monies. Another piece that's worth pointing out is that starting in the early 1980s, Iran starts reaching out to create new alliances and new partners throughout the Middle East in order to export in some way the revolution. Probably the clearest exportation of the revolution is the creation of Hezbollah in Lebanon in 1983. And in the previous year, he was able to foment a serious alliance, which has continued to this day, with Hafez al-Assad of Syria. Now, it's interesting to note that while in Iran, politicians like Hafez al-Assad would be individuals like Mehdi Bazargan, which Ayatollah Khomeini fought assiduously against. But in the context of a relationship in Syria, he was willing to support that kind of politician because it expanded the reach of the Islamic Republic. There's a question as to what catalyzed Iran's hatred of Israel. A lot of the clerics in Iran, both from the Islamist left and from those who were loyal to Khomeini, saw Israel as a Western imperialist incursion into the Middle East that was upsetting the natural balance of power, which is that was the territory of the Palestinians and it should be theirs. You also have antagonism from the fact that Israel helped train the Savak. And so that negativity continued. So it's those major things, but in many ways, and this is the position of many Iranians as well, the antagonism towards Israel is in many ways used as a lever in order to avoid criticism of the regime by saying that the regime is the defender of the State of Israel. The defender of the Palestinians against the State of Israel. Is it fair to say that this period was characterized by a somewhat fluid moral center? I would say it's more like you have a piece of putty and you stretch it out and then you cut off the end piece. And then you stretch out what's left and you cut off the end piece. And you stretch out what's left and you cut off the end piece. And this is how, piece by piece, Khomeini was able to isolate any particular group, be it the National Front, be it the Islamist left, be it the Tudeh Communist Party, be it any of these groups, the Mujahideen al-Khalq, any of these groups. And by so doing, he was able to concretize power in his person and in the institutions he created. And so it's not that the center was fluid, but that the leftmost extreme kept getting cut off. But of course, when we're talking about what happened in the 1980s, the leftmost extreme is center-right. So we then come to the Iran-Iraq War, which is the longest single war of the 20th century, certainly one of the most brutal wars of the 20th century in the Middle Eastern context. And we should sort of go into a little bit of history about what was going on here. So there had always been problems and issues concerning the exact border between Iraq and Iran on the beachfront, what's called the Shat al-Arab, or the Arab beach. And Iraqi leadership in 1975 met with the Shah, who was in power then, in Algiers. You can see Boumediene, who was the president of Algeria at the time. and negotiated an exact border between Iraq and Iran in the Shatt al-Arab. Unfortunately, the Iraqis were never terribly satisfied with this conclusion, given that the majority of the population on the eastern side, on the Iranian side of the border, was still Arab. And so they considered that to be part of Iraq's historic territory. It's also not surprising that significant deposits of oil happen to be in those areas with a large Arab majority on top of them, which is also probably part of the reason why he wanted that land. And the disorder that existed in Iran during the 1980s, when you have the Komiteh and the Hezbollah trying to fight all these different regional groups and manifestations of the Shah's residual authority, Saddam thought it was an effective time to invade the country. And you can see that he made significant gains, especially in the region of Khuzestan, that southwestern region of Iran, between the period of 1980 and 1982. But those gains, while they were made in the first few months of the war, quickly became stalled for a variety of reasons. The first one is that Khomeini was able to use the Iraqi attack on Iran to consolidate his own position as the defender of the country. So this, combined with the fact that he was consolidating political power on other grounds, using new versions of the constitution, cutting off the terms of various leaders, being able to create votes of no confidence, restricting elections. He was also able to consolidate power because there was an existential threat to the Islamic Republic itself, the Iraqi invasion. And Khomeini was able to incentivize large numbers of Iranians to join the battle. And there are several reasons he was able to do this. The first one is that he began to roll back requirements for want of a better term, consent to be involved in the creation of Iranian militaries. And so what ended up happening was the recruitment of young boys. And it's believed that roughly 550,000 Iranian boys were recruited during the Iran-Iraq War on the Iranian side. These boys were disproportionately used in human wave attacks, which is where the Iranians would send out a wave of humans to blow up all the mines that the Iraqis had put in the ground. For those who have been following the Ukraine war, in many ways, the Iraq-Iran conflict exemplifies what's been going on in the Ukraine war from the perspective of technology and casualties. So Iraq had access to global markets. Iraq was still in an alliance with the United States. Iraq had access to numerous different arms shipments, and Iran did not. But Iran had a significantly larger population. And so Iran could throw more and more people at the problem in a way that Iraq couldn't. And so it became this quest, this fight between military from a military perspective of equipment versus lives. Now, there's a question of whether these boys were from lower socioeconomic statuses. Overwhelmingly, yes. As with typical military recruitment and drafting, it tends to prey upon the lower classes much more so than the upper classes. Now, there are questions as to why, one, Iranians didn't use animals. If they had to blow up the mines, why didn't they use animals? It turns out that when a couple animals get blown up by a mine, the other ones scatter. And so they're not effective at moving forward and clearing the mines. Human beings, by contrast, can be trained to keep going forward despite seeing people die around them. And so that's why human beings were sacrificed rather than animals. As to why human beings could be convinced that they were going to heaven or that this was justified, Khomeini issued plastic keys to go around the necks of all of these children such that they would have a key to heaven if they died. And you can imagine, between the indoctrination that they were getting in schools, between the adoration that was seen in the Iranian media for their sacrifice, you had a lot of enlistment and enrollment. And so of the 2 million, of the millions of Iranians who served in the war, these children are disproportionately represented. One of the interesting things about the fighting is that, similar again to the Ukraine war that exists now, despite both sides having aircraft of some variety, by and large, the fighting ended up being trench warfare and just throwing people into these large meat grinders, which is why after a few months of strong Iraqi incursions, they weren't able to make much progress afterwards. And so the Iraqis decided that they would change tactics and began what was called the War of the Cities, which is where they launched long-distance missiles targeted at Iranian cities, and Iran retaliated in kind. These missiles were overwhelmingly inaccurate to the extent that they couldn't target exact buildings or places, and resulted in large-scale civilian casualties on both sides. And you can see the maps of those areas targeted by those cities. But because the air forces couldn't work in tandem with the missiles, with the ground forces, trench warfare was effectively what ended up happening. And that's actually very similar to what's happening in Ukraine now. There's a question as to whether those are Scud missiles. Some of them were. There were other types of missiles also involved. Most Scuds that Westerners are familiar with are the ones that Iraq launched in the other direction over Jordan to hit Israel during the 1991 Gulf War. But Iran was supplied by the Soviet Union and the United States at this point. So it had weapons from both. There's a question as to whether the families were ever remunerated for the deaths of their children. I'm sure there is some sort of fund that gives something, but Iran has never admitted that it was a crime or that it shouldn't have been done. In fact, the Iranian government continues to say that this was necessary in order to keep Iraq out and to maintain Iranian independence. Another point that's worth making is that Iraq used chemical weapons against Iranians. There are a couple instances of Iranians using chemical weapons against Iraqis, but almost always these are tear gas. In the Iraqi case, however, against Iranians, they used mustard gas and other types of agents that are known to disfigure and deform people. And so you had a lot of Iranian civilians who suffered from these chemical weapons, as well as soldiers. Now, the actual trajectory of the war is rather interesting in that from 1980 until 1982, it was an Iraqi advance into Iranian territory, and Saddam Hussein realized this was going nowhere. So in 1982, in June, he decided to use the Israeli invasion of Lebanon as a way to save face, saying that he wanted to deploy his Iraqi troops in Lebanon to fight the Israelis rather than to fight the Iranians. Muslims should make peace with each other. And Saddam Hussein was also surprised that he didn't get the support of Iranian Sunnis and Iranian Arabs like he expected that he would. And so on June 20th, Iraq began a 2-week phased withdrawal from Iran and tried to create a ceasefire. But Ayatollah Khomeini was not having it. Significant parts of Iranian infrastructure have been destroyed. There were over 1 million refugees already. In fact, by 1991, there would be about 2 million refugees within Iran, some of them who were IDPs, some of whom were cross-border. And he wanted to export the revolution to Iraq. He said that he would not cease fighting until Baghdad was part of the Islamic Revolution. And so he launched a counter-invasion of Iraq that made very little headway. You can see the map. They conquered some areas around the Fao Peninsula in the Shatt al-Arab, and a few other areas. But the war dragged on and on. It resulted in increasingly more casualties and expenses for Iran to maintain, until Rafsanjani, who was the who was the president during this period, Rafsanjani, who was the president during this period, prime minister in this period, convinced Khomeini to stand down, to accept the 8th UN ceasefire proposal, and let everybody bury their dead. The way he did this was through a euphemism of a poison chalice, that the United States was never going to let Iran export the Islamist revolution to Iraq, and therefore it made no sense to continue the struggle. And it's worth talking about. There's a question actually about which parties were supporting who. So it's worth talking about who was supporting who in the war. One of the interesting ironies of history is that Israel was pro-Iranian in the Iran-Iraq war. And they were pro-Iranian for several different reasons. The first one was that they wanted to try and bridge the gap between the Islamic Republic and Israel that was already beginning to form. And so Israel sent weapon supplies to Iran in order to facilitate. Israel also sent military commanders to provide tactical advice. Iran refuses to admit that this has occurred. Israel also took advantage for its own sake. Iraq in the 1980s was beginning development on nuclear weapons technologies, and so Israel was afraid for its own security and bombed the Iraq reactor in 1981 in what's called Operation Opera. But of course, stalling Iraq's nuclear program would be beneficial to Iran in the context of the Iran-Iraq war. And of course, Israel helped the United States in the Iran-Contra affair, which we're going to talk about in a second. The United States and the Soviet Union and China all provided support to Iraq during the war. You can see Donald Rumsfeld meeting with Saddam Hussein and basically giving him a blank check in order to defend the country. The Soviet Union initially supported Iran. The Soviet Union finally got involved in 1982, and this is one of those few instances where the Soviets and the United States are actually on the same side of the conflict, which creates this very sort of strange relationship. Now, Iran was able to finance its war needs from the export of oil to the extent that it was able to do so. Iraq was not. And so Iraq required Arab finances from Kuwait, from Saudi Arabia, in order to support its ability to keep purchasing American-made weapons or weapons made in the European Union. One of the problems that Iran had, of course, was that while the Shah had built up a large military, and so there was equipment, there was very little ability to repair what was broken. And so there was a constant Iranian attempt to evade the isolationism that it had brought upon itself through the attack on the US embassy and other similarly situated events in order to try and acquire new weapons or repair older ones. And there's a point here that there are many countries like the United States, like China, like the United States and like China, which supported both the Iranians and the Iraqis at different points in the war, under different circumstances. In many cases, it was just giving weapons to both sides and letting them fight it out. And so in many ways, this became a testing ground for how different countries' weapons would fight against other countries' weapons. So the Iran-Contra affair is a rather strange situation that has a lot more to do with US domestic politics than with Iran, but Iran is certainly involved here. And the fundamental issue is that the United States wanted to support the Contras, or rather, let's be more clear. Ronald Reagan and his administration wanted to support the Contras, which was a right-wing militant group in Nicaragua. The problem, of course, is that the Contras were a human rights disaster. Every organization lambasted how badly they treated dissidents and those who disagreed with their policies. And it got to the point where even the US Congress was willing to make a decision. And the US Congress argued that there could be no more money paid to the Contras in order to support the rebellion against the Sandinista left-wing government. Well, couldn't have that. So the Reagan administration wanted to figure out how they could get money to the Contras without creating an apportion from Congress. So what ended up happening is that they decided to give weapons in surplus to Israel, which Congress was willing to permit. And Israel would provide those surplus weapons to Iran. As we mentioned, Israel supported Iran in the Iran-Iraq War. Iran would pay Israel for the weapons. Israel would give that money to the United States, because those are US weapons. Then that money would be funneled to the Contras. So it's debated whether Ronald Reagan himself was directly aware of or collaborated with or organized the Iran-Contra affair. We know for certain that Oliver North did. On the Iranian side, probably the most famous person involved was Munchaher Ghorbanifar, called Gorba by Westerners who struggle with names that are that long. And Ghorbanifar had been connected to the Savak, to the Israelis, because the Israelis had initially helped train the Savak, and to the Americans for the same reason. And he was able to facilitate all the connections needed to get those weapons from Israel to Iran and get the money from Iran to the United States. Of course, this was all eventually found out and a stop was put to it, but not until after Iran had gotten a sizable amount of weapons from the United States through this method and was able to continue prosecuting its war against Iraq, which was from 1982 to 1988 when it was on the offensive. Now, one of the things that I've sort of avoided talking about, but goes through all of these different periods that we've discussed, is the prospect of Kurdish nationalism. And Kurdish nationalism affects Kurds both on the Iranian side and on the Iraqi side of the border, not to mention, of course, those that are on the that are in Syria or in Turkey, although that's not directly relevant to what we're talking about today. So the first thing is that Kurdish nationalism existed at multiple different points. And so the first independent Kurdish state was the Republic of Mahabad, which was a Soviet client state in northwestern Iran. And in December of 1946, it was reoccupied by the Shah's military after the successful negotiation of Ahmed Kavam. We discussed that last week. Now, this should show the desire of the Kurds for some degree of independence. They were following up from Sibko Shikak's rebellion in the 1920s, and so on. Now, during the early days of the Islamic Revolution, the PDKI, or the People's Democratic, the Kurdish People's Democratic Party in Iran, was in favor of the Islamic Revolution against the Shah. However, when they tried to send a representative, Abdurrahman Ghazemlu, who you can see there, to the Constitutional Convention, he was forbidden because the Ayatollah did not like his Kurdish ancestry. And in fact, the Comité had been fighting with a number of Kurdish insurgents from the PDKI and other groups in Kurdistan, in Iranian Kurdistan, in order to assert power there. One of the things that points to how badly the Kurds were treated by the Comité was when those Kurdish militants were arrested and executed by the Iranian government itself. You can see, for example, that famous picture, the execution of the Kurdish militants in Sanandaj, which actually won the Pulitzer Prize, and shows the death of a number of arrested Kurdish militants at the behest of the forces of the Iranian government. Now, the Iranians were also not blind to the situation in Iraq. And so one of the ways to destabilize Iraq under Saddam, who was an enemy of the Shah in the 1970s, was to fund the Iraqi Kurds. And so relations had developed between the Iraqi Kurds and the Iranian government. And as a counter to this, Iraq developed relations with the MEK, the Mujahideen al-Khalq, which was an anti-Iranian militia based by Iranians. So what ends up happening is you end up having the Kurds being instrumentalized by the opposing parties in the war, while the Kurds are trying to seek their own nationalistic aims through that engagement. This results in the Iraqi context in the Al-Anfal campaign, which was a campaign of extermination by the Saddam government against the Kurds in the north, starting in 1986 and continuing until 1988. This campaign was particularly notable for the attack on the city of Halabja, which was attacked with chemical weapons, such that thousands of civilians died. And the Kurds continued to be persecuted. They were also forced out of numerous mixed cities like Kirkuk and Mosul in order to Arabize those cities. Other minorities had somewhat of a different reaction. The Assyrian population, which are an Iraqi Christian population, were also living in what is dominantly Kurdish territory. And the Assyrians had two possibilities. If they ascribed to an Arab identity, they were able to become part of Saddam's government. And in fact, Tariq Aziz is probably the most famous of these individuals. In fact, Tariq Aziz was an Arab name that was given to him as a laqab or a nickname. His true name escapes me, but it's an Assyrian name, not an Arabic name. And those Assyrians that clung to an Assyrian ethnic identity founded the Assyrian Democratic Movement, commonly known as Zawa, or the movement. And the Zawa fought alongside the Kurds in parallel, not together, against the Al-Anfal campaign, which targeted them too for extermination. In fact, in areas where there were both Assyrians and Kurds, Assyrians were exterminated at a higher rate than were Kurds, although Kurds bore the brunt in both numbers of people and the percentage of the groups attacked in Iraq. Accordingly, Iran in the post-2003 environment has been able to rekindle a lot of the alliances that had been developed in the 1970s, and again developed during the 1980s during the Iran-Iraq War with the Kurdish population. And you can see Masoud Barzani shaking hands with Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif in 2014. But Masoud Barzani was also the leader of the the Democratic Kurdish Party, the PDK, and had a relationship with the Iranian government in the 1980s as well. He and his father Mustafa were long-term leaders of the Kurdish people, given the historic power of the Barzani family. So coming out of the Iran-Iraq War, there was a massive difficulty in readjusting. You can see, for example, this is the Battle of Khorramshahr, which is the city most affected by the Iran-Iraq War on the Iranian side of the border. And the amount of devastation would require an immense amount of reinvestment and cleanup, and that would fall on the subsequent administration. Another serious issue was the indoctrination and the result from the indoctrination of the Iranian population. You can see here, this is a mural outside of, I want to say Tehran University, of Hussein Fahmideh, who was a martyr in the Iranian part of the Iran-Iraq War because he uncorked a grenade, ran under an Iraqi tank and gave both his life and gave his life to destroy that Iraqi tank. And you can see how Khomeini even said Fahmideh is his leader because of his heroic sacrifice. And so there was a generation in which this martyrdom was celebrated and accepted, but increasingly, as that generation became parents to their own kids, a lot of negativity began to develop over the feeling of being cheated, of having lost that generation, of numerous mothers having given birth to children only for those children to die, and the hollowness of that in the fact that the Iran-Iraq war didn't result in any material changes, no reparations, nothing, just a pure ceasefire at the end of the conflict. You also had the Faili Kurds, who were Shiite Kurds based in Iraq, who had mostly fled to Iran, and a number of other refugees, for a total of 2 million refugees from Iraq or from elsewhere, or from the attacked cities in Iran, who needed shelter, who needed a place to go. And Iran didn't have the financial means necessarily to take care of them. The isolation that the Iranian government was still facing on the international scene, and of course, during the Iran-Iraq war, Iranian GDP fell substantially, such that by the year 1990, GDP was less than 40% of what it had been in the early 1980s. And since this is GDP per capita, you can understand this is the wealth of the entire country collapsing, which was a very difficult period for Rafsanjani to get through. But there's an important thing to point out, is that as Ayatollah Khomeini was dying, he did two major things. The first one is more famous internationally, which is the Salman Rushdie affair. Salman Rushdie published a book called The Satanic Verses. He is a British Indian author, so no connection to Iran. And there were protests in Pakistan about the book, which discusses 3 verses that were originally part of the Quranic revelation, but that which Muhammad later argued were inspired not by God, but by the devil. And so they don't exist in modern Qurans. And these verses talk about worship of gods other than Allah. Now, when the book came out, there was actually no the book wasn't banned in Iran until on 14th of February 1989, Khomeini issued a fatwa about it. And people argue that he issued a fatwa primarily because those riots in Pakistan, and he didn't want to be seen as being outstripped as leader of the Islamic world. Remember, he'd been cutting into that pie and demonstrating his Islamic credentials. If he let something like this through, this could provide an avenue for somebody to out-Islam him. Another point to make here is that while Salman Rushdie still lives, and he did suffer an attack recently in 2022, but generally speaking, he has been safe because he has a lot of protection in the UK and in the United States, where he now lives. Many of his translators have been less lucky. The translator of the Italian version of his book was stabbed. The translator for the Japanese version of his book was killed. The translator for the Norwegian version of his book was shot, but lived. So in many cases, the fatwa has had an international power to curtail freedom of speech. And in fact, the strongest objectors to the fatwa against Salman Rushdie were other literati in the Islamic world. Naguib Mahfouz was probably the most famous of these, who was an Egyptian who had won the Nobel Prize for literature. But that's the big, loud event in 1989. The more silent event was the coup of 1989, which was the complete overhaul by an illegally constructed constitutional revisionist group to redo the constitution. This 1989 coup eliminated many of the last vestiges of democracy within the Republican structure in Iran. The power of the supreme leader was made absolute and not conditional anymore on popular authority as it had been in the first decade. a number of branches of government that had previously been independent became directly controlled by the supreme leader, like the judiciary, the media, and the possibility of creating a referendum or revising the constitution. Religious minorities that had some of their power still remaining were limited in terms of their ability to operate within ministries and to have anything more than one representative in the majlis. And one of the most interesting ones, at least in my view, is that Ali Khamenei, who was the chosen successor of Khomeini, couldn't be a supreme leader under the laws of the 1979 constitution because he wasn't a mujtahid. He, at that time, was a Hujjat al-Islam, which is a level below. And so he didn't have the qualifications to become the supreme leader. So the conditions were revised so that Ali Khamenei could be an exception to the rule and become the supreme leader. One of the funny ironies in how this was implemented, though, was that despite the constitutional revision group operating in secret and quickly, they didn't have enough time to implement the constitutional revisions before Khomeini died, which meant that they were in a strange position where the only person who could approve the changes would be the supreme leader, but there was no supreme leader who was alive. So they allowed Ali Khamenei, who would be the future supreme leader, to approve the revisions that would allow him to take power in the first place. And yet, this power transfer occurred without a hitch, without major interruption in government. And to this point, Khamenei has remained the supreme leader of Iran since that point in 1989. And so now we get to the period of the presidencies. And I have a question here about what was Rafsanjani's power base and how did he maintain power and position given the sharp battles between the hardliners and the so-called moderates. Rafsanjani was able to maintain power because he was both. He was both a moderate and a hardliner. And in fact, people have said about Rafsanjani that with regards to the economy, he was left-wing. With regards to politics, he was extremely conservative. And with regards to corruption, he was the best, in the sense that he was the most corrupt that Iran has ever had. And Rafsanjani was able to play these different groups by supporting one or two things that they were involved in. As we can see, he ruled from 1989 to 1997, which was the recovery period from the Iran-Iraq War. And during that period, he rebuilt Iranian infrastructure, allowed for external investment, began to cultivate relations with the West. In fact, Rafsanjani was probably the most effective Iranian negotiator to speak with the United States or with Western Europe. And he was also able to maintain the friendship of Ali Khamenei despite their numerous disagreements. After him, we have a continual back and forth between liberal Iranian leaders, who I've indicated in this arrow as blue, and conservative Iranian leaders that I've indicated as green. And one of the things worth pointing out is Rafsanjani, Khatami, Rouhani, and Raisi are all clerics themselves. And the reason for this is that the Guardian Council in Iran has the ability to choose who can run. So candidates will submit their application and the Guardian Council will approve or not, and then those people can run. And so overwhelmingly, the people they allow to run are Muslim clerics. Ahmadinejad was the one exception. He's a lay leader. But the Guardian Council is generally more forgiving of conservatives than they are of left-wingers. And Khatami was probably about as left-wing as Iran was able to ever go. He was a very strong modernist and a very strong reformer. And as a member of the reformist camp, he wanted to expand the freedom of speech and gave license to numerous newspapers to open up and begin reporting, which Ali Khamenei found very distressing. So he closed them immediately, using the Hezbollahi and the Pastaran in order to shutter them. And so you end up having this situation where whenever a reformist is in power and they try to execute reforms, Ali Khamenei undercuts them. And so you have this fight within the structure of the Iranian state between the supreme leader and a reformist or you have the acquiescence of a conservative like Ahmadinejad. Now, there are a few things that I want to bring up about this time period in general. The first one is that Khatami was president during the 9/11 attack on the United States. And contrary to what existed in numerous other Middle Eastern countries, Iran issued statements of condolences to the United States. Both Khamenei and Khatami did this, arguing that the terrorism that was inflicted on the United States was a cowardly act, and an act that Iran fully disagrees with, despite its numerous disagreements with the United States as a political power. Despite this, Khatami was blindsided by the creation of the axis of evil, an axis of evil in Bush's language of January 29th, 2002, primarily in regards to their nuclear ambitions. And those nuclear ambitions we'll talk about in more detail. But throughout the 90s, Rafsanjani was able to work out with the Russians the ability to create the Bushehr nuclear power plant, which you can see a picture of there. And yeah, there's a question as to why all of them are in power for 8 years. There is no term limit in Iran. Rafsanjani actually ran for a third term. But generally, it's the case that after 2 4-year terms, somebody else ends up winning the presidency. So while it's not forbidden for somebody to run for more terms, generally it's not done. One of the nuclear issues, of course, the primary nuclear issue that has been escalated is that the United States and Israel believe that Iran is in pursuit of a nuclear weapon. Iran argues that it is pursuing nuclear power for purely peaceful means, and Khamenei has gone on the record saying that it is un-Islamic to have a nuclear weapon, but Western powers are incredibly skeptical. Now, in order to try and work on this, the Obama administration worked with the Europeans in order to create the JCPOA, which was a nuclear agreement signed with Iran in 2015 that would unfreeze a significant part of Iranian assets abroad and permit Iran to continue work in its nuclear environment, provided that the IAEA could supervise those events. Now, one of the things that is often overlooked is that nuclear policy is one of the few things that the Iranian youth, who are a disproportionately large part of Iran's demographic, are in favor of from the regime. There are a lot of other actions that the regime does, such as sartorial requirements, right? How do you dress? The international isolation, the failure to maintain a stable currency, all of these kinds of things, the use of the budget to export the revolution or to support militants in other countries that are generally not favored, but the pursuit of nuclear independence is one that is, because it goes back to Iran asserting itself against imperialist powers, like we said, Britain and Russia throughout the 19th and early 20th century, against the United States during the period of Muhammad Reza Pahlavi, and now in the reorganized world. And so it's one of the major reasons, in addition to any weapons interest that Iran might have, that the government wants to continue to pursue nuclear power because of how popular it is relatively compared to other of its policies. One thing that's worth pointing out is that Hassan Rouhani, who was the more liberal, the reformist candidate who won in 2013 and presided over the JCPOA, credited a lot of his win to the actions of Khatami, who was who is censured from the Iranian media despite being a former president because of his views that Khamenei doesn't like. And one of the curiosities is that Khatami was able to galvanize people to vote for Rouhani in 2013 through the use of social media like YouTube that the Iranian government didn't control. There's one last point that I want to make, and it's in regards to that demographic map. Most Middle Eastern countries have a purely rising demography. That is to say that as the age goes up, the number of people go down. It's basically either a triangle or a triangle with a square on the bottom. But as you can see with Iran, you have a bulge around the 40-year-old mark, and then you have an inlet around the 25-year-old mark, and the population appears to be decreasing in terms of it's not reaching that large wave that existed for that 40-year-old demographic. Iran is a country whose population is not growing at a substantial rate, contrary to many other Middle Eastern countries. And this is for a variety of reasons. Some have posited that it's because of Iran's high rate of urbanization relative to other Middle Eastern countries. Some have argued that it's a result of the female empowerment that exists in Iran, which, despite the fact that women have to dress in a hijab, they're able to go to university and they do have the possibility of working in skilled jobs. Much of this is a holdover from the Shah's period. There are others who argue that this is a direct result of the demoralization that came after the Iran-Iraq War, when many people had had kids during the war, which is why you have that 40-year-old bump. Many people had kids during the war because of government support for that, financially speaking. Emotionally, that created a generation that was plagued by the trauma of many people missing. And so many of them didn't want to have kids or couldn't have kids. There are a variety of reasons, but Iran's demography is fundamentally different from other places in the Middle East, and it's worth pointing that out for a bit. As we move into the more reformist camps, we start to see that the common way that Iranians try to manifest is through large-scale protest. And I want to focus on two different protests that have occurred recently. You have the Green Movement, which took place in 2009, and the Mahsa Amini protests, which started in 2022, and have continued until the present. The Green Movement was in response to the 2009 vote between President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who was seeking his second term, and Mir Hossein Mousavi, who was seeking a first term as a reformist candidate. Now, Mir Hossein Mousavi was part of that Islamist left, like Abdul Hossein Bani Sadr, but managed to remain on the Khomeini's good side, and therefore continued having a role in politics for as long as Khomeini was still alive. He was the prime minister. He had a good functional relationship with Khatami and was interested in overturning the Ahmadinejad state. Now, the elections that happened in 2009 were obviously, from the perception of many Iranians, were obviously rigged, because Ahmadinejad won in every demographic, in every region, including areas like Azerbaijan, despite the fact that Mousavi is Azeri. Among youth, despite the fact that the youth are disproportionately anti-clerical and non-conservative, and a number of other things. And so you had a large-scale protest that occurred to try and overturn the results or force an examination of the results. Unfortunately, without foreign support, especially without US support, those protests ended up dying down after about a year and a half of continuing throughout the country. On the question of Mahsa Amini is a case where she was Kurdish, but under Iran's laws of the Ayatollahs have reimposed, it's a reaction to the Kashf hijab, the forcible removal of the hijab. Now the hijab is forcibly mandatory. And the religious police, who operate within the context of Iran, ended up killing Mahsa Amini over her violation of not having a head covering. And those protests continue in Iran. Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of good photos of those. So this is a protest in solidarity in Washington, D.C. And in fact, the struggle still continues. You can see Niloufar Hamidi and Alaha Mohammadi, who were literally last month, in May of 2023, brought to trial in courts because they were the ones who publicized the story of Mahsa Amini and in and are considered by the Iranian government to be responsible for the protests. Iran has already executed over 40 people that it considers enemies of the state for having promoted the Mahsa Amini protests, and yet they still continue. It's worth noting that a lot of antipathy has grown up in the younger generation towards the Islamist nature of the country and its lack of democratic freedoms, so much so that many Shiite Muslims are leaving. It's unclear the exact number of Shiites who are no longer in their heart of hearts Shiite, despite what they say on the census, because leaving Islam is illegal and punishable. But it's estimated that over 10% of Iran is functionally atheist, if not more, because of this. And Hussein Khomeini, who is the grandson of Ruhollah Khomeini, the first supreme leader, has argued that the Iranian Republic, the Islamic Republic, needs to be dismantled and turned into a pure secular democracy because the state's identity of being a Shiite state is effectively creating the end of Shiite Islam with these mass deconversions. And of course, there are also conversions to Christianity. Now, there's a lot of discussion to be had about minorities and other groups. Generally speaking, within the context of Iran, minorities are treated relatively well. The Azeri are disproportionately represented in government and always have been. Ali Khamenei, for example, is Azeri himself. Mir Hossein Mousavi, who didn't win the election, was Azeri. And so you have, for president, and so you have a large Azeri representation. That said, there are groups trying to create an independent South Azerbaijan. You have Lurish groups who are trying to push for independence. And so Turkmens, Balochis, Kurds, and the political representatives of these groups exist in absentia, and they have created a Congress of Nationalities for a federal Iran, trying to push externally on Iran to give increased rights to minorities, to respect minority languages and cultures to a degree that the current government doesn't. Now, one of the things to point out is that a lot of the antipathy that exists at a governmental level and not at a personal level. Within Iran, most minorities get on relatively well with each other and with the Persian majority. It just happens that at a local level or at a governmental level, the laws are not in their favor, such as laws preventing the teaching of their language in schools and universities, laws minimizing the independence narratives in their history, especially among Kurds and Balochis, who seek more independence than some of the other groups do. And of course, you have the Arab minority in Khuzestan that feels very strongly about the Iranian government, given its pivotal position in the Iran-Iraq war. So I'm going to cover the rest of this, all of Iran's foreign relations, next week when I start. Sorry. So I'm going to cover the rest of Iran's foreign relations next week when we do the early revolutionary Iraq as sort of a carryover. And we will do 3 episodes, half of next week, and then the week following, and then we're going to be off the July 4th week, and then we're going to be back on July 12th to finish with the Iraq War and modern Iraq. So that's where we're going in the future. And we have got to our question period, so please put your questions in the chat. Or raise your hand if you want to ask your question auditorily. And while you're getting those questions together, let me tell you a little bit about who we are. This is History, Mostly Ancient Discussions. I am leading the Middle Eastern Islamic History group, and we have a number of other events. We do Asian philosophy. Occasionally we do European Union security, powerful women, dead languages, all kinds of really great stuff. And of course, we have our smaller short run series and older series that we still have. So we encourage you to look at our content and see what you'd like and learn more about history and the rest of it. All right. There's a question here. What is the difference between Arabs and other Muslims in Iran? Sure. Let's go back a little bit. So the Arabs as a population exist primarily along the coastline. You can see them in the area around the Shatt al-Arab, close to the Iraqi border, and you can see them close to the Strait of Hormuz, which means that in the former case, they're in a very resource-heavy location. In the secondary location, they're in a very strategic location, given that most of Iran's oil has to flow through the Persian Gulf to get anywhere. And the population also, as you can see from this map, is they are primarily Shiite, but so is the southern part of Iraq. And so there's a long history of them feeling that they should be part of Iraq because of that Arab Shiite connection. And Iran has maintained these borders, though, against Iraq for nearly 400 years, since the Treaty of Zahab in 1735, more or less. There have been some slight changes in territory, but that's about it. And as a result, you have a lot more irredentism. In fact, the Arabs don't call the region Khuzestan, they call it Ahvaz or Ahwaz. So that's the functional difference. There's a question. The Iraqis are claiming the Mahdi, Muqtada al-Sadr, is back because of him helping Iraq's poor. How often do the Shia claim there's a Mahdi? There are some people who claim that Muqtada al-Sadr is a Mahdi. I'm not familiar with that claim. It's definitely a minimal claim to the extent that it exists. Al-Sadr is a leader, certainly a clerical leader in the community. But I don't think that a lot of people believe he's the Mahdi. To the extent that there are people who claim that they are in consultation with the secretive 12th Imam, that's actually quite common. So Ayatollah Khomeini said that, Muqtada al-Sadr has said that, Ali Sistani, who's the great Ayatollah of Iraq, has said that. A number of others have said that they are in consultation, or that they've met with, or that they have spiritual connections to the hidden 12th Imam, and that's quite common. But declaring that you're the Mahdi is rather difficult, because Jesus has to return to earth first before the Mahdi comes. So, yeah. There's a question about Sadat. I'm trying to find it. There's a question about what the British did in Iraq in 1953, similar to what they did in Barbados. I think this is confusing Barbados for Grenada in terms of the 1983 overturning of the government. Maybe I'm wrong here. Somebody can clarify that for me. But the coup d'etat in Grenada was an actual American military operation. The American military was not deployed in 1953. The Americans paid a lot of money to thugs who already existed on the ground and worked with Kashani and other Islamists who wanted the overthrow of the Mossadegh government. So it was more like the Americans put the band together than that the Americans actually overturned the government directly. Oh, the Barbados thing is for the sugar plantations. I mean, I guess you could say it's the same in that the British wanted to prevent a country from industrializing and incorporating the wealth from its own productivity into its own nascent economy. But I think that's sort of where the similarity ends. There's a question with Saudi Arabia and Iran setting aside their differences in Egypt, Iran, and Saudi Arabia wanting to join the BRICS. With Russia and China, how does Iran leverage that in their conflict with Israel? I think that's a really great question. I don't know. The peace between, or rather, the recognition between Iran and Saudi Arabia is something that I'm finding hard to understand. I don't know how long or how effective it's going to be. To the extent that Iran can capitalize on this and form a meaningful relationship with Saudi Arabia, that leaves Israel out in the cold very, very quickly. Israel's primary foreign policy in the first, let's say, 30 years of its existence, 1948 to 1979, was to ally with the periphery states, that's Turkey, Iran, and the United States and Western European countries, against the Arab states that surrounded it. And they did that until 79, when Egypt became the dominant player on the US team, and Iran had the revolution, which sort of ostracized them. And so Israel ended up playing the Sunni card. And so the Sunni states wanted to have peace with Israel more because they feared Iran. They feared what Khomeini was trying to do to Iraq. In fact, that's why they were willing to extend so many loans to Iraq in the war, loans that eventually facilitated Iraq's economic downfall, unless they could invade Kuwait and recoup the oil. So, but if Saudi Arabia goes into a pro-Iranian direction, there's a genuine fear that the other Sunni states will follow. And so you'll have sort of a rump of Western aligned states, Jordan, Israel, maybe Egypt on a good day, because Egypt desperately needs American money, Turkey, and Turkey is ambivalent about the rise of Iran. So Israel would be in a very difficult position if the Saudi-Iranian friendship matures. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think that from an institutional perspective that Saudi and Iranian interests align sufficiently for them to avoid all the proxy wars they've been having. There's a question of, apparently there's a water issue between Afghanistan and Iran's border. What caused this? Doesn't Iran have other water sources? Yes. Iran has several water sources, but the problem is that Iran's water sources are not like the Mississippi, where the Mississippi branches out into numerous different states and then funnels into one exit to the ocean. Iran's water sources are in parallel. So it's not as if you cut off one water source, you can reroute from another tributary. And so what ends up happening is you have the Helmand River, which starts in Afghanistan and then flows into the eastern part of Iran. You can see where you see Sistan of Baluchistan. That's where the river flows through. So it comes from Afghanistan and goes down that way. And the Helmand River is absolutely necessary for agriculture in that area of the country, because that area is very arid without the river. It doesn't get rain for much of the year. And so the dam that Afghanistan is building has the possibility of severely limiting the water in that part of the country. And combine that with Iran's already already massive water shortage problems, generally speaking, throughout the country. This would just add insult to injury. Now, one of the things that I was going to cover, but we obviously can't get there because I don't have enough time, and we'll do it next week, is that Iran and Afghanistan under the Taliban are very, very negative towards each other. And so Iran's like to the point where Iran actually worked with the United States to help facilitate the survival of the American-led coalition government in Afghanistan, because they did not want the Taliban to come back. Well, surprised they did. And the enmity is over territorial claims, over the forms of Islamism that they have, which are mutually exclusive because one is derived from Sunnism, an anti-Shiite in orientation, the other is Shiite and anti-Sunni in orientation. So, long story short, on the water, the dam looks like it's going to be built, and Iran is in really no position to invade Afghanistan or conquer Afghanistan, and the Northern Alliance has been thoroughly discredited, which would have been Iran's traditional way of intervening. So it's going to be very difficult for farmers in Sistan and Baluchistan. What do you have to say about the different groups opposed to the mullahs? I would have you have two different groups listed, like the NSG, OAIC, the National Council. I would have to look up those specific groups. Generally speaking, my view is actually very similar to the view here, which is that I think that Iran should be a federal republic, and it should be a democratic state where people vote unencumbered for political parties that represent their interests in a proportionally representative system. I don't know to the extent that those groups support those goals. Most of them seem to. I think the details are in the fine print, and it's one of those things of let's get rid of the current government and then let's see what happens. And the thing about my view is that my feeling is that if Iran gets rid of the clerics directly in government, even if it takes sort of a Sharia Madari approach, right, where the clerics have a lot of strong influence but no direct representation, Iran will become a democracy very quickly. It's one of the few places where you have a respect for other minorities and groups within your borders as a general rule by the population. You have a general idea that the rule of law should be respected. You have a general idea about Western norms and behaviors. So democracy actually could work in Iran. So I would need to know the nuts and bolts of their positions. There's a question, Egypt has a multitude of problems. We talked about Egypt's problems with Aish bread in both the Egyptian presentation, which I think was episode 69, and the last most recent episode on the Ukraine war. I don't think that Iran is ever going to capitalize on a relationship with Egypt, and there's a lot of bad blood between Iran and Egypt, so it would be capitalizing on the relationship with Saudi Arabia, which I think is the bigger fish. And it's questionable whether that will happen because they don't really share any points of allegiance other than that they like China, because China buys a lot of petroleum. And so China is actually both Iran and Saudi Arabia's biggest petroleum customer. There's a question, do you have any idea why a guy keeps insisting that my facts are wrong? My intuition is that he's probably pro-Shah, and I am too. I just criticize what I like. because I think it can be better, and I criticize what I hate because I think it can be better. So if I had to choose between the Shah and the Ayatollah, I would choose the Shah because the Ayatollah didn't improve anything. The economy got worse. Personal surveillance got worse. The ability for Iranians to speak their mind got worse. But I think a lot of people want to look at the Shah's period as a rosier period, and then perhaps it was. And I don't think it was there. I think that it's if the Shah had continued as he did between 1941 and 1953, 1941 and 1951, if he had continued in that vein and increasingly devolved power and basically made himself like the King of England, I think Iran would still have a Shah, and Iran would be a much better place than it is now. But that's not the Shah we had, and the result was an Islamic Revolution, which pushed the country back in a conservative, reactionary, but revolutionary direction. The question is, why not Mossadegh? The Mossadegh was the one who they wanted to remove. The U.S. tried to court Mossadegh until late 1952, but by and large, Mossadegh was substantially in favor of the profit sharing or nationalization of the Abadan oil refinery. And so there was no reason to court him from the British perspective. From the American perspective, they stopped courting him in 1953 when Eisenhower became president because they thought that he was too aligned with the communists. And so they didn't want to court him for that perspective. I think that covers all of the questions. I want to say thank you to everybody who said really nice things in the comments about the presentation, how much you enjoyed it, and I really appreciate that so many of you came out and decided to hear me ramble on for, what is it now, 2 hours and 40 minutes. So 2 hours and 20 minutes. So I hope that you come next week, and I hope you enjoyed what you saw here. And if you do, that you see some of the other presentations I've done, and yeah. Any last questions before we sign out? There's a question about the meetup address. The meetup address is here. Let me see if I can copy it. Okay, so put the meetup address in the chat. All right, so I'll see everybody next week. Bye for now.